Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining Darien Library this Thursday afternoon. Today we are joined by Europa's editor-in-chief, Michael Reynolds. Many of you may know Michael already from our Book Buzz events where he's often been a contributor. He is here with Anne Goldstein, who has translated the work of Elena Ferrante and contributed to making her an international success. This event is co-sponsored by Barrett Bookstore. If you haven't picked up your copy of The Lying Life of Adults, I know they have a few left. Before we begin, I would like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections, available to the community. And now let's go straight to Michael and Anne.
All right, thank you very much, Marianne.
Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to visit your lovely library up there. And even if we can't do that this time, this is the next best thing. And thanks, I've been watching all of the people join this this event, and thank you for joining us. And Anne, thank you for your tireless work on behalf of this book and all of these events that you've been doing for The Lying Life of Adults. So I would like to jump in on the question of translation, Anne, and Italian, specifically starting with Italian. Sort of where did your relationship with Italian begin?
I think I always had a secret unconscious dream of learning Italian, which became conscious when I was in college, and I knew that I needed to read Dante. I took a Dante class, and I loved Dante, and I actually took the same class twice. But we read Dante in a parallel text, and I had the idea that I knew I studied Latin, had a lot of years of Latin and a fair number of years of French, so I could kind of puzzle it out, but I really wanted to learn Italian. And that was how it started. But then there was a gap of about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years before I actually learned Italian and was able to read Dante in Italian, and along with a few other writers.
And has your love of Dante endured?
It has, yeah, it has.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually recently, we had an Italian, the way I started learning Italian was that we had an Italian class at the New Yorker somehow I managed to interest some other people in this. Wasn't that hard, but anyway, this Italian class, which started in the late 1980s, is still going on. It had a few hiatuses, but it's still going on. And actually, we just read some Dante in our Italian class. We went back to Dante.
Really? Oh.
So it was kind of great.
So is the Italian class the same thing as the conversation group, or are they two different things?
No, it's the same class. It's had
Okay.
different incarnations. I mean, it started as we sort of spent a year studying grammar. Then we read Dante. We spent about 3 years reading Dante. Then it became a conversation class. And actually, it's sort of in the pandemic that it went back to being more of an studying Italian literature class.
Wow. Nice. So, I mean, just sticking with Dante for a second, does that also mean that you have been interested over the years in sort of comparing and contrasting translations of Dante? Has your interest gone that far or not?
No, I haven't really done much of that. I don't know. Okay. I mean, I sort of, late in the last few years, I think there have been really a lot of new Dante translations. I mean, I've glanced at them here and there, but I haven't really compared them closely. The only time I did that was when I was, as another of my major Italian writers, as you probably know, some of you, is Primo Levi. And Primo Levi, I mean, most Italian writers probably all of them, now even modern ones, they have a great depth of knowledge of Dante, which they study in school and all that. And when I needed to find Primo Levi quotes Dante a bit. And So when I needed to find a translation of Dante that would fit into the translations that we were making of Primo Levi, I spent some time looking at Dante translations.
I see. I'm skipping ahead a little bit here,
Yeah.
but we've spoken a number of times about the literary influences on Elena Ferrante, whether they've been acknowledged by Ferrante or not. Is there any Dante in Ferrante?
No, I don't know. I haven't really noticed it. I mean, anything overt in the way that you can see, as you've often, pointed out, there's a lot of Greek tragedy, for example, and then the closer Italian writers, Ortese, Morante. I don't know. You're better at this than I am.
I don't know. But I mean, yeah, I don't think it's very Ferrantian to willfully distance herself from a great writer like Dante, but it does, I don't know if I see any great influence. Yeah, Dante. I don't know if it's big. Yeah, who knows why?
I don't know.
But it's yeah, that's interesting. I was talking to someone here recently in Italy about the situation that we're all in globally at the moment, and the fact that in Italy, one of the things that has, I think, helped Italy keep the situation under control is this sort of sense of a common culture, of a shared culture, yeah, that one in moments of crisis can rely on. And that person, an Italian, sort of responded to me, saying what it meant for everybody in school to have read Dante, like every Italian, whether you're educated or not, whether you're an intellectual or not, whether you're cultured and cultivated or not, you all have read a little bit of Dante, and you can probably also remember those two lines that you studied until you wept, in school. And what about translation, Anne? When did that start for you?
It started about 5 or 6 years after, maybe 5 years after I'd started learning Italian. Like all translators, I have I have an accident story. I mean, most people started accidentally. Mine was because when I was working at the New Yorker, and the editor, Bob Gottlieb, had gotten a book in Italian from the artist Saul Steinberg by his friend Aldo Buzzi, who was a writer that most people don't know who he is, but he was actually quite a wonderful writer. And Bob Gottlieb knew that I was studying Italian, and he gave me the book, and he said, can you just look at it so I can, say something nice to Saul? So I looked at it, and I actually really found it fascinating. It's called Chekhov in Sondrio, and it's about the relationship of Italians to Russian literature. Yeah. So it's kind of a great, so I looked at this and I thought, maybe I should just try translating it, because it would be a way into the Italian language that I haven't really explored. And it would be a way of learning it, of looking at it from a different angle. So I did, so I just translated. I mean, I just did it, just for the fun of it, really, or for the interest of it. But then I thought, I'm just going to give this to Bob. And then he published it. So that was really how I started.
And so this largesse of the New Yorker to support your learning of Italian came in the end at a price. I mean, they asked for their pound of flesh, let's say, or their pound of translation.
Yeah. Well, I used to say that the New Yorker was the support, the financial support for my translation habit. Yeah.
Yeah. At the New Yorker, your work was in the copy department, the renowned New Yorker copy department, and most recently as the head of the copy department. Is there a connection between copy editing and translating?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is. I think there's quite a, in some ways there's a very close connection, which is that you learn to be very attentive to the details of words and structures of sentences. And I think that's, you need to know all that to have that kind of attentiveness in translating. And I think I learned that in the New Yorker copy department. We had, just the attention to each writer and each writer's style to, I mean, it's true, we had strict rules of grammar and style, but I think that really was helpful in a way.
So you learned something about the art of translation from the work as a copy editor. What about during what is now a more than 20-year career also as a translator, some of it parallel with also being at the New Yorker? What have you learned about translation? Or maybe a better question is there anything to learn about translation, or is it just a question of practice?
Well, a lot of it is a question of practice, but certainly there's a lot to learn about a language. I mean, about the details of a language that you don't necessarily learn in a class, even a grammar class. I mean, even like the starting off class where you learn the verbs and you learn the nouns and you learn all those things. I mean, Italian, it turns out, which I don't think I really understood until, I mean, you understand a little more with each thing that you do. I mean, it's very complex. I mean, the verb tenses, first of all, it's got, hundreds of verb tenses, verb forms, which aren't necessarily, that aren't necessary to know. Even as a translator, you don't have to know them, but you do have to sort of recognize them and understand the structure of the language. And I think that I'm always learning something about that, and about when a writer is very close to the what would you say, the strict grammatical structure, and when a writer moves away from it. So I think I think there's always something to be learned.
Have you done any translations from other languages?
No, I haven't.
Have you kept up your French?
No.
No.
No. I haven't really, I mean, I've kept my...
I just think because I have a project in mind. Man.
Oh,
No,
I mean, I don't know. I did have this, one time I was staying in a hotel in Ravello, actually, working on the Days of Abandonment, my first Ferrante translation. Yeah. It was January, and it was, I don't know, the middle of, there was nobody there. And then these French people came to the hotel, and they were asking about, they wanted some, I forget why they wanted this or why they would have been asking for it in January. I know this is kind of a long-winded story, but they couldn't think of the word for, they needed to find the French word, maybe they were Russian people, they wanted to find the French word for strawberries, I guess. And I reached back into some dark past and I pulled it out. So I think the French is there.
It's still there. You mentioned now the work on your first Ferrante translation. I have a two-part question. Do you think that to translate well, you need to share some affinity with the writer that you're translating, or some sympathy for the characters or the prose? And if so, what is it that you responded to in Ferrante when you first started translating her?
Well, I mean, as a general rule, I don't think you do need to feel any particular sympathy with the writer, because as I said, you're always going to learn something from it. I mean, you might get more frustrated with a writer that's not congenial or that you find more of a struggle, but certainly I would never not translate something because I didn't like the writer or didn't find the writer congenial. But I will say that I did feel like an instant bond with Ferrante. I mean, I think, whoever Ferrante is, the person who writes the books, I mean, she's someone that's more or less my age. We've lived through the same history, even though, of course, I didn't grow up in Naples and I didn't experience Italian history. But I think that there's a kind of, there is some kind of affinity, or I immediately felt a kind of, I don't know, sympathy or empathy with her narrators. Maybe I should put it that way. Even though in the earlier books the narrators are younger, but still, there's still that, they are about women. I mean, they're mostly about women's experience. I mean, in the Neapolitan novels, obviously there's a much broader, more expansive frame and many more characters, but still the focus is on you know, the experience of women in the second half of the 20th century, and you know, that's kind of what I am. So I just immediately did feel that it was something that I don't know, that I knew something about, or that I wanted to learn more about, which is something else that I think happens with Ferrante.
That gives me oh, I'm getting an echo now. I hope nobody else is hearing that. A bit of a segue to talk about this new book, The Lying Life of Adults, because you have your copy as well. We have matching copies. You have Post-its on yours, but I feel I've been shirking my duties. It is. Is that level of, I don't quite know how to frame this question actually. The protagonist in this book is younger. You know, of course we've had the younger protagonists in the beginning, the first book of the Neapolitan novels. But I think this is you know, there was a sense that those protagonists were always going to grow and always going to get older. And here, this is very much a book narrated by and about a young preteen moving into teenage years. Now, I feel that despite that, you still feel that author there, the author's voice, the authorial presence, you still feel a woman of what we suspect to be Ferrante's age telling this story. Is the same true for you? Did you feel that when you read this book?
I felt that, well, it's kind of a double, it's almost a double voice. I mean, I did, at first I thought I don't really want to go back and be a teenager again. But then I you know, you're sort of gripped by it. I mean, because I think it's Ferrante, this voice that you do recognize telling the story, really. I mean, she's very much taken on I want to say she's taken on the persona of a teenager, but she's in the teenager's mind. She's able to sort of go back into, let's say, her mind as a teenager, and give you all the details of what's going on. I mean, and how it feels to be that teenager. And yet, at the same time, it is this the voice that you recognize of Ferrante, or at least that I recognize. Seemed to me that it was her voice, and it was her sentences, her way of examining what's going on. You know, what the character is going through. So, yeah.
Do you feel that over, gosh, it's been a lot of books now, because it's not just the novels.
No, there's all the other stuff.
There are 7, well, again, it depends how you count, right? 7, 4 plus 7, 8 novels, a long work of non-fiction, a short work of non-fiction, and then sundry other bits and pieces around a children's book as well. Do you sense a shift in Ferrante's preoccupations and stylistic approach, or has it felt consistent to you?
To me, it's felt mostly consistent. I mean, I think that as I sort of said, you know, her preoccupations are with the experience, women's experience, with the relationships of, you know, with friends, obviously, with friends, with parents, with lovers, or husbands, whoever, partners, and with, especially in the Neapolitan novels, with society too, and with writing. I mean, with, you know, women as writers, and, you know, her own, I guess you could say, preoccupation with writing and words. And so I think in a way her preoccupations or occupations have been similar. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm doing the questions here. I'm asking the questions. I think so too. I think it's been, you know, I often say that one of the most interesting books for me of Ferrante's is Troubling Love, which is her very first book written, gosh, 35 years ago, something like that.
92 or something.
Yeah, 30 years ago. and a slim book, but to me a book that seems to contain, like a seed, everything else that came afterwards. And this book for me is no different from that. I think, you know, one of the things I found interesting about this book was the introduction, more or less for the first time in any, I felt in any real significant way, of the church as a an antagonist maybe in the book, or yeah, as an agent, at least in the book, and that seemed sort of a novelty to me, or somewhat of a novelty.
Yeah, although there's the whole thing with the religion teacher in the Neapolitan novels, which is like a little side issue in a way, but it does recur.
Yeah, and it's a good aside as well. It's developed well in the Neapolitan novels, but here, you know, here
it's really more as you say, the church.
And I wonder, you know, I think, let me know what you think. One of the things I think about Giovanna as a character is that she apparently, ostensibly, has an easier time of that emancipating, let's call it emancipation, sort of carving out, trying to find a path of her own, which is also a recurring theme in the books of Ferrante. Here she seems in some respects to have an easier time of it, because she has a great education, and she has culture, and she has points of cultural reference, and a family that on the surface are supportive, and you know, they're economically well off, and this, that, and the other. And I wonder if you know, the church in a certain sense, or characters who are connected to the church, were sort of introduced as a hurdle that she had to get past, given that she had the education already. It was very much, education is so big a role, plays such a big role in the Neapolitan novels. You got to get it right. You got to get that education. That's your path out. Here, she doesn't have that issue, so there's got to be another.
She's got to get over the church.
You got to get over the church,
or figure out the church.
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe. That's definitely could be. Yeah.
How do you feel about Giovanna as a character? Do you think she's as memorable and well, I think we can probably use the word universal at this point, given the worldwide success of Ferrante, as Lila and Lenore?
I think she is. I mean, I don't know if she's as memorable, just because we haven't had 1,800 pages of her. So we haven't had quite as much experience. But she's definitely a memorable character, and she as with Lila and Lenore, I mean, she's a person who is very much her own particular person, but she also, I mean, everybody has had we've all grown up one way or another, and had to confront, you know, sort of what we thought the world was and what the world turns out to be. I mean, whether it's our parents or someone else, some other, whatever figures there are in your world, you know, and sort of understanding them. And I think that in that way, she's definitely, the story is universal. I mean, you know, we all have to deal with those issues on, you know, with different details, but certainly in some form. So I do think that she's, universal.
Was there a specific moment, or is there an anecdote that you tell yourself about when you first sort of got an inkling of the level of Ferrante's success and readership and reach into sort of the culture?
I know. I mean, I think that the first book to be published in English, The Days of Abandonment, had a certain amount of success. I mean, I thought that was a really successful book. I mean, I thought that did really well. Everybody was reading it. People were talking about it. I mean, everybody that I knew was reading, people were talking about it. So I thought that was, you know, that was great. That was successful. So I really had no idea that it was going to become this other, you know, successful in another way. Did you?
No, I didn't know. I mean, I feel the same. I thought The Days of Abandonment for us, also because it was our Europa's very first title, so it was straight out of the gate like that. It was wonderful to have that success, and it did feel that it, you know, it was being read by a lot of people and commented upon. And I think for a while, Ferrante was in danger of becoming that cursed thing, the writer's writer, right? Because there are a lot of writers who really admired her. When I first read My Brilliant Friend, I certainly appreciated that this was probably going to garner a broader readership, because it was just simply a bigger book, a bigger canvas, more characters, many more ways into the story. But, you know, that said, you know, I can convey in numbers what I expected. We printed 12,000 copies of My Brilliant Friend, and would have been more than pleased to have sold just those 12,000 copies, right? And we're now up to, I think, 3.5 million or something like that in English of the Neapolitan novels. So no, you know, there's no way to expect that kind of that level of success. But I do, you know, I think the year, I mean, for me, there were two moments, and one of them you're sort of implicated in, when James Wood's review came in.
Oh, yeah, right.
I remember that very, very clearly.
Yeah,
I remember where I was. I remember the weather.
Really?
Yeah, everything about it. And I also remember the sensation of it's a long piece, maybe
it is, yeah,
a page longer than a typical review of his. And it was so glowing and so positive that as I was reaching the end and reading down the last column, I was thinking, God, the snark at the end of this review is going to be so devastating. It's going to be terrible. And then I just finished it, and it was positive from start to finish.
Yeah.
And that, I think reading that review, and I think this turned out to be true, I didn't necessarily think, oh, this is going to sell gads of copies, but I did think this was going to legitimize or validate people's admiration of Ferrante, and people will talk about it and talk about her a lot more, and that's sort of what happened. And then I think about a year after that, when we started doing events that we're still doing, where it's like the Rolling Thunder tour, the Rolling Thunder Ferrante tour. When we started doing events, and without an author, and without anyone to speak on behalf of the author, but just speakers who admired this writer, we were, you know, getting hundreds of people coming to these events, and then, you know, you in Sydney drawing 2,000 people to an event with you and the publisher. When those kinds of things started happening, I realized that, you know, there was something of a completely different magnitude happening. But I like also, I remember, I can't remember now if you told me or if I read it when you spoke about the UN group.
Oh, the UN book club. Yeah,
the UN book club. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was nice as well. Yeah, that story of sort of seeing, you know, 20 women from 20 different countries with their own perspective and their you know, their own
experience, really.
Experience with Ferrante. It was that was quite eye-opening as well.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite book, Anne?
Not really. I mean, I sometimes think it's The Days of Abandonment, just because it was the first one, and other times I think it's My Brilliant Friend. I don't know. No, you? And sometimes it's Troubling Love. I don't know.
And sometimes it's Troubling Love. I always go back to Troubling Love to, you know, it's actually the book that I've read most often, maybe because it's short, of Ferrante's. I haven't read the Neapolitan novels since we worked on them together.
No.
and I did read Lying Life twice, but and I've read Days of Abandonment a second time, but I think Troubling Love maybe I've read 3 times or 4 times, I think. And each time I find it, I used to think of it as a quite messy book because that's how I remember it. And each time I read it, I think, structurally and formally, it's actually quite brilliant. And so I like that book a lot. But yeah, then there's the very first book that I read was The Days of Abandonment as well. So that has always.
So you read that before you read Troubling Love?
I did, yeah. When I first moved to Italy, that had just been published, or a year after, or 2 years after, I think. And it was getting a lot of attention. And I had never heard of Ferrante before, so I picked it up and read it. Yeah. Very good. Should we hand it over to questions now? You guys tell me.
Yes, please.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Michael. And let's see, we just have a couple of questions. One is, it seems like from Margot, it seems like so much of what's said in The Lying Life of Adults is said in Neapolitan vernacular. I can't help but thinking that some of this color or off color is lost in translation. Can you comment on what you found in the original text and what readers of the English language version might be missing?
Well, Ferrante doesn't actually write in dialect, or not very much. So there isn't a lot of, she doesn't report whole conversations, or give you whole conversations in Neapolitan. I mostly try to, when there are conversations and they're said to be in Neapolitan, or even when they're not, conversation is much more colloquial. It's more informal, a little more slangy than the more formal parts of the writing are. People who know Neapolitan say that there is a kind of Neapolitan cast to her writing. I don't know Neapolitan, or not very, I know a little bit, but not much. I wouldn't know how to say that. But yes, I suppose it's lost. I try to do things like, another thing that is that, for example, the nicknames, the names, the nicknames, the street names, the names of places. I think some of that gives you a sense of Naples, a sense of being in Italy, a sense of even of being in another language. So that, I think that's another way of trying to make up for the fact that you don't hear Neapolitan.
Also, when do you decide, Anne, not to translate word for word, but instead go off the text?
When or how?
When?
When? Oh, there's no way to say when. It's it's completely, it depends. It depends on, I wouldn't say that sometimes I do translate word for word to a certain extent, but it has to fit, it has to be readable in English. Oh. Sometimes people forget that one of the things that a translator has to be good in his or her own language, really, to have some skill in his or her own language in order to translate, not just skill and knowledge of the other language.
Oh, Michael, can you please tell us about why you decided to publish the excerpt in the New York Times, as that seemed an unusual marketing ploy in this digital age?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the conversation that we had with the New York Times was around creating something that would be special. Yeah. So not necessarily, or at least with that piece of our marketing, we didn't necessarily feel that we needed to reach the biggest possible audience. What we needed to do, I think, was to reach a core audience, and the audience in this case of the subscribers to the New York Times, with something that was special, that stood out from what everybody else is doing. And you know, that was, I think, yeah, that was what the New York Times was sort of coming to us with, this idea of creating a real special object. We had a very long and complex and I think well thought out marketing plan, and there were a lot of digital components to it, a lot of components that were aimed at reaching a broad audience. This was sort of in parallel with that, something that was more focused on creating something beautiful.
Michael and Anne have mentioned the Neapolitan Chronicles a number of times today. Are you referring to the Neapolitan novels by Ferrante or to the Neapolitan Chronicles by Anna Marie Ortese that is said to have inspired Elena Ferrante?
I think we were referring to the Neapolitan novels by Ferrante. But yeah, Ortese is certainly one of the influences that Ferrante mentions at times, yeah.
Okay. We have any more questions? Let's see. I think Rosanna from Barrett Bookstore, she wants to say thank you for giving them such a wonderful book to sell. And Michael, when you first brought Elena Ferrante's work, did you know that you would ask Anne to translate?
Well, that's a funny story. When I first started with the company that sort of would become Europa, I started working for Europa. Just a little backstory here. Europa is owned by an Italian publishing house, or an Italian couple, who also run an Italian publishing house, and they also publish Elena Ferrante. So they're Ferrante's Italian publisher. And Europa is their baby, their child. And I had started working with the Italian publishing company, and after a few sort of as a freelancer, and after a few short months, we started talking about this, this idea of opening up Europa editions. And I sort of threw my name into the hat as translator and as editor. And then we said, well, so what are we going to publish? What do you want me to translate? And they said, well, it's not that easy. Slow down there, young fella. We're going to ask for some sample translations from a bunch of translators, and then we're going to see which one is the best, and then decide who's going to translate it. So there were a number of people who did sample translations, me including, and others. And I get the news that my sample translation was not up to par, and that a certain Anne Goldstein had beaten me out on the translation gig, but my editing was okay, so they were going to give me the editing job. So then I got to work on a bunch of Anne's translations, which has been a great pleasure and an honor. And I'm glad that she got the gig.
Well, so am I.
Why did Elena Ferrante get involved in excising certain parts when I understand she does not get involved in editing Anne's translations?
She didn't excise any
She
part.
didn't?
No.
Oh, okay.
No.
Okay. So
no.
No.
There were, but there was some. Somebody asked me a similar question about another book that we published, Incidental Inventions, and that was essentially a collection of essays that she wrote and Anne translated for the Guardian newspaper. When that book was published in Italian, she wanted to look at those essays. And she made a few small changes, but she also wanted that the edition that we published in America as a book were the original essays published in the Guardian. So there are some small differences between the Italian edition and the English edition of that book, but because she made some changes on her original there before it was in Italian, published in Italian.
I guess what the woman who asked this question, Ellen, said is that the New York Times excerpts
No, I
said that
see.
certain parts were excised at the
I
author's
see.
request.
Yes, absolutely. No, not exactly. No, that's not correct. The parts were not edited out at the author's request. An indication that parts had been edited out was at the author's request, because the New York Times made some significant cuts in order to create an excerpt, as you know, as magazines and newspapers do all the time, in order to create an excerpt that read smoothly from one end to the other and wasn't, you know, 50 pages long. And Ferrante asked that the New York Times indicate where they had made those edits, so that everyone reading that was aware that it wasn't the same in the book. But she didn't do the cuts. No.
And someone else has asked, does Ferrante speak English?
I think she reads English, don't you think?
I think so. Seems that way, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All righty. And Ellen, thanks you for explaining the excise information, Michael.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I think, let's see, does Elena Ferrante have any say in choosing the translator?
I have no idea.
I'm not sure that she would let Anne go at this point. Yeah, there's sort of a tacit understanding.
I bet.
Yeah, but I don't know if she read the sample translations, honestly. I would be surprised if she did, but I don't know. Yeah.
And Christina is asking if you are a writer yourself, apart from being a translator and copy editor.
No.
Okay. Okay. And Joellen is interested in knowing if either of you have ever met Ferrante.
No.
Okay, then somebody else is remarking on the controversy as to her true identity.
I'm unaware of any controversy.
Well, I'm sure you're asked that at every event.
I don't know if this is true for you, Anne, but I used to get questions about the identity a lot more in the past.
Yeah.
And it seems that her readers, her fans, the people that come to the events, the people who are at events now have, you know, they've gotten over the question of identity. And I think that, you know, that somehow goes to prove Ferrante's point. Yeah, that you can get as much, probably more, no, I would say that certainly more from the books, reading the books, thinking about the books, going to the books for answers to your question, rather than, you know, having an author around sort of getting in the way of your reading.
How do Anne and Elena communicate over questions in the translations?
I write to the editors in Rome and they get in touch with her.
Okay.
I write, and then she gets in touch with, she tells them and they tell me.
And Anne is asking if you have ever lived in Italy. How did you learn vocabulary for words such as boob?
No, I haven't ever lived in Italy. I mean, I spent a fair amount of time there. So, you know, there's many ways of learning the language. I mean, obviously it would be better if I lived there, or if I do live there, who knows what will happen in the future. But you know, I mean, most of my Italian I've learned, or a lot of it, from just from reading other books, reading the dictionary, reading different kinds of things, talking to people.
And you also continue to do translations for other authors.
Yes.
For A Girl Returned recently,
Mm-hmm.
by Donatella Di Pietro.
Pietrantonio. Yeah.
Pietrantonio.
Yeah.
Is it difficult for you after having spent so much time translating Ferrante?
No, I mean, it's interesting. It's always interesting to translate another writer. I mean, sometimes I work on one or two writers at the same, two writers at the same time, because I have this theory, which is perhaps driven by necessity of some sort, that it's good to have more than one Italian voice in your head at the same time, because they often reinforce or contradict, or it's just an interesting way of working, or it helps me somehow.
Oh, interesting. I think that is...
You guys, I can say, I would add to that answer for those of you interested in this question, you should go read the Anne Goldstein oeuvre, all of her translations, and you'll see what a sort of magician she is when it comes to voice and register and tone. Sometimes it shocks me and scares me, the degree to which she captures an author's voice.
Well, thank you, Michael.
Michael, are you still translating?
No, after that experience, after that slap down, I just stayed down.
I think that we have just enjoyed one of the most delightful hours between an editor and translator that we are apt to have in many, many months to come. Thank you both, Michael and Anne. This has been a lovely hour.
Thank you, Marianne.
So much, Marianne.
Bye now.
All right.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. This
Thank
was
you.
wonderful.